All right. Well, welcome everyone. Thank you so much for joining this session today. Really excited to have everyone, and really excited to be here for this session. So, just by quick introductions, I'm Josh Woodard. I'm the Senior Digital Advisor with USAID's Bureau for Resilience, Environment, and Food Security. Um, and for those of you who attended this morning's very first opening session, you'll have heard Dina Esposito, who's the assistant to the administrator for the bureau where I sit, reference the launch of this toolkit today. And it's something that we're really excited about. I can say personally, as someone who has developed my fair share of toolkits related to using digital technology for development, I'm really excited about this toolkit in particular that the team you'll be hearing from today developed. While there's a lot of good guidance out there, I think already that's related to overcoming digital divides for specific groups such as women or persons with disabilities. Before we started out on this toolkit, we couldn't find anything that looked deeply at how one's intersectional identity can impact their meaningful use of digital technology. So you'll hear more from the team about what we mean by intersectionality, but essentially it's about looking at all aspects of an individual's identity to understand how that might impact their experiences with digital technology, at least in the context of this work. Intersectionality in the context of other things is not going to be related to digital technology explicitly necessarily. So this toolkit aims to help USAID staff and implementing partners on how to design inclusive digital technology interventions in Feed the Future activities that are mindful of potential digital divides and can therefore be more intentional about how they are addressing those divides. Hopefully moving towards transformative approaches that reach those individuals and communities that are more likely to be digitally excluded. While it's been written through the lens of Feed the Future activities, I really want to stress that the toolkit's recommendations and guided activities are going to be useful to anyone who's implementing food security activities that are using digital technologies or thinking about using digital technologies, whether they're funded by USAID or not. So today you'll get a sneak peek into some of the key frameworks and recommendations outlined in the toolkit, as well as a real-world example of what this looks like in practice. You will also, towards the end of the session, the team will be sharing the link to the actual toolkit, so you can go and check it out and start to explore it yourself. So I want to thank the team at Athena Infonomics, Genesis Analytics, and DAI for all their hard work over the past several months developing this toolkit, which, I'll note, was very much shaped by conversations with and feedback from dozens of practitioners from across the globe. Perhaps some of you who are joining us today as well. I also want to thank Yona from Digital Green, who will be sharing their perspectives on digital inclusion with us today. So I'm really looking forward to an engaging session today. We have just under an hour together. So please, if you have questions, you have thoughts, share those throughout, and the team will try to get to as many of those as they can. And so with that, let me hand it over to Emily to get us started.
Great. Fantastic. Thank you so much, Josh. Appreciate it. Okay. All right. Well, welcome everybody. Thank you so much for being here. As mentioned, I'm Emily Springer, and I will sort of be doing an overview of what this toolkit includes for you today. So you will be hearing from myself as well as one other team member today, but it's important to note there was a group of people behind this work, notably Mariette McCampbell, Tom Orrell, the Genesis team, which included Chloe Van Wittern, which you'll hear from today, as well as Mark Schoman, Carrie Scott, and Clemmy Borthwick, as well as the Athena team, which was led by Shruti Vishwanathan. So Josh tasked us with creating a toolkit to build practical guidance for USAID staff and their partners on how to design broadly and meaningfully inclusive digital technologies for REFS activities. So with that, let's dive into the agenda today. So broadly, we are going to be talking in 3 different chunks. So the first is that I will discuss the toolkit's content, and then I'll share sort of an in-depth example about what we are calling the new intersectional digital inclusion framework. Second, my colleague Chloe will then demo how to utilize the framework as applied to a case study, looking at Digital Green's new conversational chatbot. And third, we'll really open up for discussion. And that's where I'm delighted to note that Yona Rapishti has joined us as the head of global gender programs at Digital Green as a special guest. And so we'll be able to have a robust discussion at the end. Okay, so why is this toolkit important? We think there are 4 key value adds to this toolkit. So the first is that we're moving beyond this focus on access of devices and connectivity status to a richer, more integrated look at what it means to actually overcome digital divides to benefit from participation in a solution or a technology. Additionally, we move beyond a strong focus on men and women as the key social groups to consider inclusion. Second, we aim to build reader understanding of intersectionality as not only a concept, but actually a practical tool to better understand the realities of participants of USAID programs and activities. Third, we offer the intersectional digital inclusion framework to help guide and outline strategic and tactical actions that USAID and partner staff can take. And last but not least, there is a big focus in the 4th module on what does digital inclusion actually look like in practice. We talk a lot about this, but what does it truly look like? And there are 3 long case studies in module 4 that help demonstrate the practical constraints such as time, money, and information that need to be successfully managed in digital inclusion on the ground. So the intended audience for the toolkit is USAID headquarters and country-based staff, as well as implementing partners. Hopefully that's you on the call here today. So now I'm going to tell you a little bit about the structure of the toolkit. So it includes meaningful content related to
Chloe, do you want to jump in and take over? It looks like we've lost Emily.
Sure. So the structure of the toolkit includes meaningful content related to digital inclusion and can serve multiple purposes depending on what is most relevant to you. You can learn about digital inclusion or complete a user readiness assessment and see the challenges inherent in digital inclusion work. The toolkit will have internal jump links for you to move to the right content based on what you're looking to understand and what is right for you in the moment. And it's not really meant to be read from cover to cover, more to assist you in your particular needs. We've designed 4 modules, each with a distinct purpose. The first introduces the reader to the building blocks needed for digital inclusion and presents the digital inclusion framework. The second module outlines how to deeply engage with potential users and complete participatory processes to ensure user needs are considered in the design. The third module links this knowledge and practice over to realities of designing and implementing the activity. And in the final module, as Emily previously mentioned, we include 3 long-form case studies. In addition to the module content, there are also a set of activities throughout the toolkit. For example, if you're reading the toolkit to learn and strategize about the future, the activities are optional. But if you're reading these concepts and tools to apply to a planned or existing activity, there'll also be a workbook component to the toolkit where readers of the toolkit will be able to find worksheets to complete as an individual or as part of an implementation team in a joint setting. You can move through the toolkit based on your own interests, We'll be sharing only a small piece of the toolkit in today's presentation. So when we share the URL later on in the session, you'll be able to learn more about the other components of the toolkit and how it applies to your specific purposes. So a few key terms that we want to go through to ensure that we all have an understanding during today's session. Firstly is the use of the acronym FTF, activity versus a digital intervention. So activities contribute to stronger food systems, better nutrition, and greater resilience to shocks, and may or may not engage a digital component to help achieve these goals. For the activities that chose to engage digital tools to achieve their goals, the portion of the activity which does so is the digital intervention. Secondly, participants, when we refer to participants here, it's not only to smallholder farmers, but also to micro, small, and medium-sized enterprise owners, agro dealers, input suppliers, producers, etc. So these are the type of people that we want to benefit from digital interventions that are part of Feed the Future activities. Great. So this is basically an example of how you'll be able to move through the toolkit and part of what's included in the toolkit. So if you're new to digital inclusion, we suggest starting with module 1, which is linked, which you can then navigate to. For example, if you're familiar with social inclusion but new to technological design, it's suggested to start with module 2, etc. And this is how we've really planned to make the toolkit as assistive as possible to your specific needs. So diving into module 1, which is the building blocks for digital inclusion. This module covers an overview of digital inclusion. It focuses on moving beyond the common understanding of access as connectivity and users as men or women, and achieves this by looking at digital divides as interconnected and using intersectionality to understand user realities. So what we're trying to achieve in this model is overcoming digital divides by addressing and designing for inequalities and norms for more and more users. In terms of activities, which are linked to the activity workbook, what the activities that this module covers include assessing how you yourself have overcome digital divides, what your intersectional identity is and how to understand how to assess that, defining your own likelihood of digital inclusion, and finally, analyzing users from an intersectional perspective. So this is what we want to introduce as the intersectional digital inclusion framework. So we previously held a user workshop with a lot of implementing partners to sort of test the validity of the toolkit before we finalized it. And what was asked for was that during the build process for implementing partners and practitioners, that they didn't necessarily have a digital inclusion framework to refer to. So we have built this one. So this is the digital inclusion framework, and it has 3 core components, which we'll discuss in turn and are covered in more detail throughout module 1. The first is overcoming digital divides, which you can see at the top across the x-axis. We secondly look at how you can overcome these digital divides by addressing and designing for inequalities and norms, which is what the y-axis considers, and what the medium or the chunk of the framework looks at is how to include more and more people, which is what we're referring to on the diagonal. So looking at who is most likely to be included, including another layer or another set of users would be those who are potentially included but not always, and including an even additional set of users are those who are least likely to be included and are often excluded from digital interventions or solutions. So this creates our basic framework. We have indicated the x-axis, so access to tech and data, digital literacy, and offline benefit as puzzle pieces to represent the interconnectedness of these three critical digital divides. So we really wanted to indicate that these are not necessarily sequential, but they are in fact linked and reinforce one another. And then on the left-hand side of the framework, you'll see how the likelihood progresses. So what we perceive likely included to be are those who are often people, for example, who already own phones, are literate and digitally literate, and are able to engage with digital solutions. We see potentially included users as those people who have some exposure to digital tools, mobile devices, access to data, for example, and they have some literacy to engage with the devices, but maybe not necessarily complete digital or reading literacy. We see, finally, those that are likely to be excluded as users who probably don't own a device and are likely not literate or digitally literate. So we'll talk more about the arrow representing for more and more users, which is here in the top left corner in a little bit. But directionally speaking, the more digital interventions within Feed the Future activities that can achieve offline benefit for those that are at the beginning would have been likely excluded, the greatest digital inclusion can occur. So when we're looking over here, programs that focus on including those who are likely to be excluded. But any progress to the right or down is still progress and should be valued as such. So before we discuss the for more and more users component, it's important to understand what we mean by the 6 A's of meaningful usage, which is the x-axis. So many of you have probably heard or are familiar with the 5 A's of access by Roberts and Hernandez. So although this has been termed the 5 A's of access, as you see here, we've mapped them to different digital divides. This demonstrates how the 5 A's are actually more than just access, but drive towards usage. So we have looked at defining a user's digital journey by looking across digital divides and considering access to technologies and data, which would consider the affordability and availability components of the 5 A's. We've looked at digital literacy, which considers abilities and awareness, both in terms of potential tools, but also devices of the 5 A's, and then also offline benefits, which include awareness and accrual of benefits. And what we have taken and added to this 5 A's and built as a step further in this toolkit is to add a 6th A, which is the accrual of benefits, which places a focus on the benefits experienced by participants. So in simple terms, the 5 A's of access then combines with offline benefit accrual to create the 6 A's of meaningful usage. So
Chloe, I can take back over from you now. Sorry, I was able to get back on.
Great.
Great. Apologies, everyone. I've been having some internet instability today. Thank you so much, Chloe, for jumping in. Really appreciate that. All right. So yes, we add sort of this accrual of benefit, which helps to drive home this idea of our participants actually receiving the offline benefit that we would like them to. And you can't really get that unless they're able to meaningfully use these digital solutions. So meaningful usage actually occurs then when we get the 5 A's and the accrual of benefit. And that helps link the actual activities. So many of us will be working in Feed the Future activities. So it actually links that Feed the Future activity goal with the objectives of digital inclusion. And this is a really big challenge, and it's something that's covered in the 3rd module, which we don't highlight for you here today, but it is in the toolkit. So if we map the 6 A's to digital divides, we suddenly get stronger questions to then assess digital inclusion across those divides. So for example, to whom is the technology available or unavailable? Under literacy, who is aware or unaware of potential digital devices and tools? And under offline benefit, to whom is activity participation leading to accrued benefit, and who is it not yet leading to that accrued benefit? We can go ahead to the next slide then. And now we're going to shift over to the y-axis, which is really about the people that we would like to help overcome digital divides in order to achieve that greater inclusion. So it's important to realize that not all users are equally able to engage with digital tools. In module 2 in the toolkit, we spend a lot more time on sort of where users are at, what user profiles could look like. That's covered in module 2. There's only one sort of component that I'm going to talk about right now, and that's this idea of an intersectional lens, an intersectionality. So this is a word that you've probably heard a lot more about as of late, and it's also in the new Gender and Women's Equality Policy that came out earlier this year, 2023. But actually very little guidance exists on how to operationalize an intersectional lens, and this toolkit helps to fill that gap. So intersectionality is the complex, cumulative way in which the effects of multiple forms of discrimination, such as racism, sexism, classism, ableism, ageism, heterosexism, and others, combine, overlap, or intersect, especially in the experiences of marginalized or underrepresented individuals and groups. And oftentimes marginalized individuals and groups is who FTF activities are working to also serve and improve livelihoods for. So as an example, I experience the world as a highly educated American white woman, which means that I have a lot of privilege from the way those 4 dimensions that I mentioned overlap. However, as a woman, I experience gender discrimination regularly, but even that discrimination that I experience is shaped by my privileged status in the other 3 dimensions that I mentioned. So this means that existing inequalities heavily influence how people can take advantage of the opportunities provided by a Feed the Future digital intervention. So using intersectionality means that we, as activity funders or activity designers or implementers, we can actually use an intersectional lens to better understand who is likely to be included, potentially included, and likely excluded. And then that enables us to build activity programming to meet the needs of these different groups and foster greater digital inclusion. And that brings us back to the framework. Go ahead to the next slide, please. We want to scale digital inclusion for more and more users. So if you look at the top left, an intervention that only works with people who are already well off and has them buy phones and get a data plan in order to partake in potentially a new input supply management system. That might represent the least digital inclusion. Whereas an activity that works to not only include people who are likely excluded by providing workshops on how to utilize simple interfaces, potentially a USSD option to register for a bank account, that might be linked to a resiliency effort that pays farming households if rainfall is low. Thus, it's enabling them to receive an offline benefit, and the solution itself is built on a very simple interface and a low need solution. It's not requiring smartphones of any kind. So the goal of any development activity is to scale these positive benefits to more participants, creating systems level change. And this is no different for digital interventions as well. So now you'll also see across the top under the puzzle pieces and across the lower left side of the actual box, you'll see we have user stake and social norms. And we have arrows there to represent that they can sort of operate as key force multipliers on these different dimensions. So the first one is user stake. And this is really getting at the idea that, do participants have a degree of control over how their data or their assets are being used by others? Do they have a say in the design of the digital solution, and are their needs considered by decision makers who govern the processes that guide those digital technologies and how those are applied in the projects that affect those participants? And maybe even, do participants have a literal financial stake in the success of the digital tool? So it's really bringing in this idea of governance and user management and governance over the solutions that are being built as part of Feed the Future activities. The second force multiplier is this idea of social norms. So social norms are informal rules that outline what is deemed acceptable behavior in a given cultural context. So for instance, a critical social norm, such as women not being allowed to travel alone, may prevail in rural areas, but not necessarily in urban settings. And so there needs to be a local understanding of social norms. This divergence means that women in regions where social norms restrict their mobility are at a higher risk of exclusion from digital tools. Accessing a phone may require their husbands or extended family's approval as they're able to travel to go and procure those items. And that's a way of introducing social norms into the equation around digital inclusion. So in that way, social norms can act as a multiplier of digital inclusion or exclusion. The one last note on the framework before we move on. This framework is designed to help people understand that any step to the right or down in this 3x3 framework is an advancement in terms of digital inclusion. So your goal should not be to design an activity or the digital intervention within an activity, to achieve that bottom right cell of greatest digital inclusion. If that works for your activity, then that's fantastic, but that might not apply to all activities. So really the goal here is to broaden our view of digital inclusion beyond simple access and gender, and to broaden that across the digital divides and to understand how intersectionality can influence your users. So an FTF activity can make improvements in access, literacy, and offline benefit for diverse user groups. And utilizing the framework, you can also assess your intentions and organize holistic programming that can help to achieve more digital inclusion. So the goal here is progress, not perfection. So with that, I will hand it back over to Chloe, who so kindly stepped in for me. Appreciate that, who will go on to share the case study of Digital Green's new chatbot against this intersectional digital inclusion framework. Thank you.
Thank you, Emily. So Module 4 of this toolkit is intended to provide you with the opportunity to start applying some of the inclusive digital design practices in your own work by providing practical views from the field through several case studies. But our journey in compiling Module 4 started off with the intention of finding a couple of hero examples of organizations that are applying the theory of inclusive design well in reality. However, we actually struggled to identify these types of examples, and in so doing, we ended up recrafting Module 4 to focus on realizing the limitations practically of implementing this perfectly conceived inclusive design process. So what Module 4 now covers is 3 case studies that evidence some aspects of best practice, but none of which are perfect examples of inclusive digital design, as has been set out in Module 1. All of these case studies reveal limitations, practical challenges, and imperfections, some of which you are likely to face in your own work. However, these case studies provide important lessons in the design journey. Consequently, Module 4 starts off by identifying and flagging some of the common implementation constraints to putting this into practice and how stakeholders can think about mitigating these constraints. In this session, we will delve into one particular case study by Digital Green, as previously mentioned, which demonstrates how the design considerations made by the team map against the intersectional digital inclusion framework, which was introduced by Emelina. We are, as you know, joined by Yona Rupeshti today, who has been involved in the development of the solution and has been invaluable to the Athena Infonomics and Genesis team in building out this case study. So Digital Green is a global development organization well known for its work with smallholder farmers across low and middle income countries. A critical challenge that Digital Green is trying to solve for is the lack of access to timely, accurate, and actionable agronomic information faced by smallholder farmers. Where coverage by extension workers who help to bridge this information gap exists, there are still changing climate conditions and new pests, which mean that traditional advisory information is not always accurate. In addition, intersectionalities, including age, literacy, digital access, and gender, serve to compound the challenge of access to locally relevant information. For example, women typically only make up 10% of extension workers in the communities where Digital Green operates, despite the fact that the majority of rural women who are engaged, despite the fact that the majority of individuals engaged in agricultural activities are women. So to address this challenge, Digital Green developed a generative AI chatbot to improve the productivity and climate resilience of smallholder farmers. Although the starting point of this solution design is a market-in one, where there is an underlying challenge that needs to be solved for, rather than a product-out one where you are trying to implement new technology for the sake of its potential impact, Digital Green still faced exclusionary dynamics. Smallholder farmers that are most likely to be included by this chatbot solution are male smallholder farmers who produce cash crops, have access to smartphones, and are literate in accessing agronomic information via this channel. Cash crops generate typically more significant financial contributions to the economy and are consequently prioritized by research institutions and government-funded extension agent networks. Because of their economic contribution, male farmers tend to dominate cash crops, crowding out women from more strategic decision-making opportunities. As a result, women are typically more involved in non-cash crop or livestock farming, and consequently, those who are most likely to be excluded from benefiting from the solution are women producers of non-cash crops or livestock who do not own mobile devices, are not the primary decision makers of their household, and have low levels of literacy and trust in digital devices. So these are all important considerations, and as Digital Green originally considered designing the chatbot solution to interface directly with smallholder farmers, they recognized early on that the design of this solution would only be reachable by a minority of farmers, and even less so female farmers. Therefore, their early design conception would have only served those in our top left-hand corner of the digital inclusion framework, those who are most likely to be included. Digital Green came to understand this from several attempts of building the chatbot for farmers, as well as their 15-year-long experience understanding which solutions resonate with farmers. So consequently, Digital Green pivoted to designing the chatbot for use by government extension agents who play an intermediary role to provide smallholder farmers with information, because they are provided with mobile devices by governments and are often trained in how to use these devices. So this was a pragmatic decision to scale digital access and reach as many farmers as possible in the pilot. But the hope is that eventually farmers can start to use the chatbot directly when they have access and the capabilities to do so, particularly after witnessing the benefits of the chatbot being used, for example, by an extension worker, which the farmer trusts and is accustomed to engaging with. But when piloting the chatbot, Digital Green focused on discussions with extension workers to determine how they were engaging with the chatbot. So Digital Green ensured overrepresentation of women extension workers in these workshops to understand how the chatbot was particularly being received by them. And a critical learning from these usability workshops was that there was difficulty by some extension workers when faced with typing out a farmer's question in the chatbot due to their own poor literacy skills. So to improve the ease of digital literacy capabilities for the digital solution and begin to include more extension workers and consequently even more smallholder farmers, Digital Green pivoted the design of their chatbot to allow extension workers to ask questions and receive answers via voice note functionality in the chatbot. From early research on developing generative AI chatbots, Digital Green came to realize that the accuracy of the generative AI suggestions, particularly on topics that have not been fully researched, cannot yet be guaranteed. Current public datasets often exhibit biases towards male-centric crops and practices, and to address this, Digital Green utilized its expansive library of gender-inclusive videos together with integrated trusted scientific resources and farmer call center transcripts, enriching the chatbot's training data. However, the information being provided was still being required to be vetted by extension workers, as it was not always locally relevant. For example, the chatbot would sometimes recommend a high-quality fertilizer, but stock of it would not necessarily be available in the pilot country. So Digital Green then incorporated a two-way feedback system into the chatbot to allow extension workers and farmers to provide real-time responses. Extension workers and farmers can instantly validate or critique information provided by the chatbot by rating it with a thumbs up or a thumbs down. They can also provide detailed insights, like challenges with specific advice in a particular locale. This feedback loop is not only valuable for continued refinement of the chatbot, but it also provides the users of the solution with an active voice in evaluating its impact and relevance to their situation, which is the offline benefit component in the digital inclusion framework. As such, the solution provides users with a sense of agency, which is linked to that 6A that we spoke about, and a stake in how the solution is developed going forward. These pivoting design choices have allowed Digital Green to steadily move downward and rightward along that digital inclusion framework, and ensuring that the majority of smallholder farmers are included in the solution. Whilst these developments are notable, there remains an excluded group of smallholder farmers, which are the women non-cash crop producers that we mentioned previously. So this is the very hardest group of farmers to reach and is where Digital Green are now placing their efforts towards including. There remains less comprehensive research to informing farming methods for non-cash crops, as academic funding typically prioritizes crops that contribute significantly to a country's GDP. And this makes it difficult to compile an accurate database on appropriate farming practices for these crops to inform a large language model chatbot. And as a result, women who farm non-cash crops and livestock remain excluded. The current two-way feedback system that has been built into the chatbot records information asked by extension workers on farmers' behalf on less commercial crops. This information is reviewed by Digital Green and sent back to their partner research institutions to motivate for further research, allowing them to branch out into non-cash crops. So in summary, several inclusive design considerations were incorporated into this initiative, which includes sourcing and building more inclusive data sets, in this case specifically to train their chatbot, conducting user research and usability testing with women and other important intersectional identities, hiring and training a more diverse product team, because Digital Green found it important in informing the empathy component of their design process, building the product or interface, ensuring that the design itself was gender inclusive in terms of language capability and simplicity, color design, voice prompts, and feedback loops. And finally, adapting training of extension agents and associated marketing tools to be gender inclusive, and training the database of the large language model in addition. So we're now going to move to the Q&A section. Before we do that, my colleague Emily is going to share the URL link to the toolkit itself, which is now live and ready for all of you to engage with. And we really hope that you'll find it impactful and valuable. So if you have any questions, please feel free to start asking them. Yona is here to answer any specific questions and to also provide more context to the Digital Green solution. And Emily and myself are also here to answer any questions that you might have on the toolkit. I see that Emily has, I think, dropped off again. So I'm going to place the link in the chat. Please let me know if you haven't been able to access it. It is in the chat, not the Q&A, and should be accessible by everyone.
To get things started, Chloe, can I ask a question to Yona? In the meantime, so Yona, I'm curious, how, as Digital Green, as you sort of think about, this journey and trying to be as inclusive as possible through your work, how do you balance the resource needs to really be sort of, fully transformative, be in that bottom box versus the, sort of the reality of what you can achieve given resources that you have? Like, what's your approach to trying to be as scrappy as possible, I guess, with what you have to be as inclusive as possible?
Yeah. Thank you, Josh. That's a great question, and one that we think about a lot. And so I guess one of the things that we've always thought about at Digital Green is how to really increase the effectiveness and the efficiency of public extension systems that are really trying to get information to farmers and help mitigate some of the challenges of climate change and really increase yields and productivity, which is kind of that North Star. And really tied in with that has always been this idea that some farmers are more visible than others and some farmers are more well-connected than others. And to really kind of create food security and build resilience, we really have to expand, get more people at the table and get more people to think and implement these improved agricultural practices rather than just those that are reached by traditional systems. And so that's exactly where the challenge that you articulated comes in. how do we, with kind of like very limited resources, think about where we can go and where we can make the most difference? And I think we approach that in a couple of ways. So one is, it's been really critical to us to think about the partnerships that we bring on board. Sometimes setting up your own systems and ensuring that they can scale, and then also that they can be sustainable, and building that from scratch is a really challenging thing if you're a small organization. So for us, we think about ourselves as kind of like providing a critical part of the system, in this case, a digital tool. At one point, it was video-based advisory. Now it's this farmer chat. But really, we rely on the infrastructure and the capabilities of these public extension systems. And we work with the ones that are already starting to be more inclusive, and we help them think about ways in which they can be more inclusive. So I think that's one way that we can kind of like really bridge this. And then the other is that we're really relying on, there's a lot of like exciting new technological change. So for example, it would have been really expensive to bring all this data and combine, for example, real-time weather, market, and all this kind of data. But LLMs and generative AI are creating a lot more simple, easy ways to take scientific information, make it really simple, but also translate it in multiple languages, in language that is simple to understand and use. So we're also capitalizing on the latest technology and using that as a way to shift into areas where it would have been really expensive to come in otherwise.
Great, thank you so much. Well, it looks like we're getting some questions here. Chloe, should I pass it over to you to moderate those?
Sure. So our first question from Nicole: are there any additional considerations or addition to the analysis of digital technologies using the toolkit in its applicability to live and interactive digital solutions, such as virtual field trips hosted in rural farming communities? I think it's a great question, and I think it's unfortunate that Emily, her connection isn't stable enough for her to answer it itself, and I think we'll definitely note these questions and respond if we can. I think in terms of the applicability of technology, we really wanted to consider the depth of the types of different digital solutions that you can develop for a participant, in this case, from something as basic as USSD to something as profound and innovative as blockchain, and what are all the different considerations in terms of how you need to think about your users and how they're going to engage with it. So I think, to answer your question, there isn't that specific option, but we really do hope that the depth, particularly in Module 2, is able to provide you with the thinking of how to implement different types of technology. Moving on to Hugo's question: in the case study, the extension agents and farmers share their knowledge with developers via the feedback channel. How are the intellectual property agreements accounting for the important contributions by these agents? Maybe, Fiona, I can pass this to you.
Yeah, absolutely. So thank you, Hugo. That's a really great question. At this early stage that we're building the AI chatbot. So when we launched it back over really the summer, a couple of months ago, the type of feedback that extension agents and the farmers that they were speaking to could give on the chatbot was a thumbs down or a thumbs up. So when they asked a question, they could really rate that question. Was it good or not? And then what we realized, that thumbs up and thumbs down, though it was valuable, it really didn't give us that much data. It didn't tell us whether the answer was inaccurate, whether it was incomplete, whether the answer was good, but it was really non-applicable because, and this is something that Chloe mentioned during her presentation, because it recommended applying, for example, or buying an input that really just wasn't locally available at that point in time. And so one of the things that we're building in this new rollout is to actually be able to give a little bit more detail around, if they do give a thumbs down, what does that mean in terms of the answer itself. But I think that the answer that you're also, and I think the provocation in your answer is, how can you really expand this to really create these chatbot and really systems in which local indigenous knowledge can be elevated and also really kind of attributed to the right people, and have them really benefit from it as well. And so this idea about bringing farmers and extension agents and their knowledge to the table is something that we're thinking about more in the long term. So in parallel to this feedback on the chatbot app, we're exploring this potential for an agricultural LLM commons approach. So this means a governance structure that's inclusive of really a diverse range of stakeholders in the global architecture sector. So what does this mean in practice? It could function like a global digital public good with a collective ownership model that's inclusive and participatory, not only of major data providers and R&D and research institutes, but for the farmers themselves. So they could really have a hand in shaping how their data is used and how AI is designed to meet their needs. Because I think what's going to be really exciting about these AI models is when we can bring in really specific farm data into the model, which can be combined with external data sets like market and weather and other things that can be combined with the latest R&D, and really the triaging of this kind of information and really protecting the farm assets and data and having the farmers benefit from it is where we can really see one is really excellent and really localized advice, make a real impact, but also make sure that it's not just an extractive model that's collecting data and then shuffling at other parts of the system.
Thank you so much, Yana. I think we have a question from Bing, but I see that Josh has responded to it. We have a couple of more minutes left, so if there are any other questions, please feel free to ask them. We've really enjoyed the questions that you've thrown at us so far.
Yeah, and I'll just quickly, just to Bing's question, just to vocalize it here. So the toolkit does talk about, this is for Feed the Future activities, it's USAID. That's just a consequence of, this is how it was funded, and so that's sort of the primary focus. But for sure, if you are working in food security activities, this is going to be relevant. Frankly speaking, if you are working in non-food security related activities, you're working in health, you're working in education, a lot of this, the frameworks, all of that are still going to be relevant. So it doesn't need to only be used in that way. But as sometimes, donor funding tends to have its sort of, own little focus, or, how it can be used, that's basically what governed that. But yes, please do not let the title fool you to think that if you're not implementing a Feed the Future activity, that this is not for you. It very most certainly is. If you're doing anything with digital and you want to be more inclusive, this toolkit is for you.
Thank you, Josh. Are there any other questions, Josh, even yourself or Yana?
So I'll ask a quick question if we don't have any others, coming in from participants. I know, that you've I've spoken with your colleagues about this, that you're training the models using sort of local content, right, to try to avoid some of the hallucinations and incorrect information that's more prevalent with generally trained models. And I was, just for fun, I was playing around, because you on the website, which if you'd like to put it in the chat, welcome you to do that. you allow people to play around and test it. And so I was playing around and I asked it something about a crop that it knew nothing about. And I found it very interesting that it said, well, I don't know anything about this crop, but let me tell you about sugarcane and how you can do that. And I'm curious just, how is that something that you have sort of pre-trained it on, that if it doesn't know something, that it should suggest something else? And how do you determine what it suggests? And is the new thing it's suggesting even going to be relevant? And maybe that's a hard question to answer in 2 minutes. But you may also want to pitch to your session that will be coming up later as a transition into this.
Yeah, no, it's a great question. And we've really have been piloting and testing this bot. And it actually has quite, right now, we've trained it in 4 value chains right now at this point in time, but we're really building the database, and very soon it will be trained on about a dozen or 2 dozen more. So the ones that it has information on, and you can get information on, is chili in India, and then potatoes, dairy, and coffee in Kenya. And so what we wanted to do was really kind of see, can we build these robust models and collect a robust enough kind of like content corpus, and then test it with these. So, and we've worked with extension agents that work really closely in our pilots with these value chains, and just to kind of see that. Now, this can be really quickly expanded to other ones, but rather than kind of using a collect and dump model, we wanted to see, does it work? And then what do we find out for these particular chains? So I think that that's why it recommends certain ones, and that's why sugarcane was outside of it. But we're really hoping to expand it to about 9,000 extension workers over the next 3 months, which is really huge, working in Ethiopia, Kenya, and India, and really kind of like expanding the value chains as well. So once we get the process right for a couple of them, it'll be a lot easier to replicate in mass.
Great. Thank you so much, Yona. Well, it looks like we're out of time. So I would like to thank Chloe, Emily, as well, even though we lost her for some of it, and Yona for this session. Really encourage people to check out the toolkit, dig into it, jump around, share it with colleagues. It's meant to be used, not just read. And yes, so thank you, everyone. And you can close out here, and we'll see everyone back in the lobby.